Hello and welcome to our final study of the book of 2 Samuel. After we have completed this, we'll be moving on to a study of 1st and 2nd Kings, and that will be available as well on our website, and hope you're interested in looking at that if you're not able to be with us in person. Today we'll be covering chapters 21 through 24, the final events in David's life, and we look forward to finishing that up and then moving on as the story continues in the book of 1 Kings. As always, if you have questions, you have other sessions that you might have missed from this study, whatever you need might be, here's our contact information on this slide right here. So now we turn our attention to 2 Samuel, again, chapters 21 through 24. The very end of that book. We notice here, according to the outline that we've been followed, that the final chapters here have to do with a mixed assortment of events in David's life. The outline here calls it the commentary of the reign of King David. It's going to include some events at the very end of his life, what's called the final words of David, and also some events that no doubt happened before that and are not in chronological order necessarily. So that will be our study. We begin in chapter 21 to see that David is going to be avenging the Gibeonites. Now, in order to understand what's going on here, we have to go back in Israel's history a good ways, in fact, to the time of Joshua, because that's where the Gibeonites first become involved in the story. And this is the beginning of an agreement that would be brought up now. In fact, God would bring it up during the time of Saul and David. Joshua chapter 9, the whole chapter basically is devoted to the relationship of the Gibeonites and the children of Israel after they crossed the Jordan under Joshua's leadership. It became obvious to the countries, the peoples that were already there in the promised land, that Israel was quite a force to be dealt with. They'd been victorious. They were numerous. God was with them. And it seemed as if maybe there would be no way to stop them. So the decision of most of the nations that inhabited Canaan were to join together and try to fight them. However, the Gibeonites realized that that was probably not going to be successful. They seemed to understand that the God of Israel was powerful and that these victories were going to continue. And so they decided, instead of fighting, that they are going to try to deceive Joshua into making an agreement with them. And that's exactly what happened. A delegation of the Gibeonites come to meet Joshua and the elders of Israel there, and they pretend to be from some distance away. They carry with them moldy bread, they wear old clothes, old sandals. Everything about them is designed to say, we've come from a long ways. We are not living right here. We're not a threat to you like the nations that are close by. And what we would like to do is make a treaty with you, make a covenant, and that there'll be peace between us and your nation. So without consulting God about this, David and the elders were in agreement with this. The elders of Israel decided to make a covenant with the Gibeonites, and they agreed that there would be peace between them. And of course, in those days, when a covenant was made like that, it was considered a very, very sacred thing and something that you just didn't break casually, even if deceit had been what was behind it. So that's what Joshua and the elders found themselves in after the deceit was recognized, because it was recognized fairly quickly. And the Gibeonites were confronted, and of course they state their case. We want there to be peace. We know you're going to be successful. And the people all say to Joshua and the elders, you need to kill these people, this delegation, and you don't need to be true to your covenant with them because they did it under deceitful circumstances. However, Joshua and the elders decide that it will be upheld, that there will still be a covenant, there will be peace among them. However, Joshua declares that the Gibeonites would perpetually be the servants of Israel. They would be something like forced labor. They would be woodcutters for them. They would be drawers of water. They would be very much in the role of servants. So while they would live and Israel was not going to attack them, they were still going to have to be lowering their level as far as existing there. They weren't going to be completely free. So that happens back in Joshua chapter 9, quite a ways before the events we'll read about here in chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. And that was the covenant, and it was a covenant which still, as far as David and the Gibeonites were concerned, was in effect. It should have been honored. However, we find out that Saul had not honored that covenant during his time. In fact, it seemed to be his nature that he was going to wipe out the Gibeons completely as a people. So we turn then to the text. There was a famine in the days of David, 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord. And the Lord answered, it is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. So the reality was that Saul had broken this covenant, this promise that Joshua had made, and that his descendants should also honor, that there be peace between the Gibeonites, and the only penalty would be that the Gibeonites would be their servants. Saul, as we've already mentioned, was determined to wipe them out, and he attempted to do that, though he was not successful. So because of that, God allows this famine year after year. And as we read that, we have to wonder why David waited 3 years before he went to God. It would seem the way that his heart was so much after the way of God that he would have gone to him rather quickly after maybe the first year, certainly after the second year, and say, Lord, what's going on? What's wrong here? Why are we suffering from this famine? But at any rate, after 3 years, he does go, and the Lord gives him this reason. This is what has happened. Now, interestingly here, David does not say, okay, God, what should I do about this? How should I go about making this up to the Gibeonites so that we can undo some of the harm that was done by Saul when he was king? But instead, as far as the text is concerned anyway, there's no consultation with God, but David goes of all places to the Gibeonites to ask how to make up for what had happened. Now, remember, the Gibeonites were a pagan nation. They were not servants of Jehovah, and they were somewhat an unlikely choice to make the decision here when David could have simply asked God what should be done. Nevertheless, that's what he did. And David said to the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? That was concerning this attempted genocide by Saul of the Gibeonite people. And how shall I make atonement that you may bless the heritage of the Lord? So David sort of writes a blank check there as far as making it up to them. As it turns out, it's a very bloody and a bitter compensation that the Gibeonites asked for. First of all, they said, we don't want gold or silver, and we're not interested in indiscriminate killing. We don't want to go in and kill a bunch of Israelites to make up for the people on our side that were killed. But here's what we want. We want 7 sons of Saul be turned over to us, and with the idea that they would be killed, and that would be the price that was paid. which was interesting when you think about the idea that they could have perhaps asked for a little bit better social position. They could have said, well, don't make us be woodcutters and carriers of water, drawers of water anymore. And that would make up for it. But they were out for vengeance, it seems. And so they say, we want 7 sons of Saul to do with as we want to, with execution being what they had in mind. Now, the fact is, Saul did not have 7 sons left. However, he did have a number of grandsons, which would fulfill what they were asking for, apparently. And so there were 7 grandsons of Saul to be turned over to them. Now, one that was a grandson of Saul that was not turned over was Mephibosheth, because we recall that David had made a vow, a covenant with Jonathan during the closeness, close friendship that they had, while King Saul, his father, was trying to kill David. And one of the promises was to show kindness to his family. And so Mephibosheth, being the son of Jonathan, was not going to be treated that way. However, 7 other grandsons, by way of some of Saul's concubines and so forth, were turned over. And all 7 of them, as the Gibeonites had planned all along, were hanged in a rather public fashion. And this would be what would supposedly satisfy the Gibeonites for the damage that had been done to them, the lives they had lost when Saul, the grandfather of these 7 men, had been determined to try to wipe out the Gibeonites. So we move on then to other events in chapter 21. One of those events was not necessarily a single war, but several skirmishes with the Philistines. The Philistines did just not seem to go away. And so we read about that, and we read about some valiant fights, some valiant efforts on the part of David's soldiers. There was war again between the Philistines and Israel, and David went down together with his servants, and they fought against the Philistines. And David grew weary, and Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, and the Philistines had several of it, turns out, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, and who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. So here's the scene. They're on the battlefield. David is fighting with the soldiers. Even though he's a king, he's fighting side by side with his soldiers that have been loyal to him through many, many difficult situations. And he literally runs out of strength. He grew weary. Perhaps he fell onto the ground. That's what was recorded many years later by the historian Josephus, which of course is not inspired writing, but may have been the case. He said David just grew weary and fell down, and that he was saved by a person by the name of Abishai. And we'll see that in the next few verses. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, "You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." Let's talk about Abishai first. Abishai was the son of David's sister, and so he was a nephew to David. And as far as his relationship with David, it was kind of up and down. He didn't always please David. But there's several crucial events that took place leading up to this one. First of all, on the occasion when David slipped into Saul's camp and he took Saul's spear and his water container, and then later on he would shout from across a valley, across the distance there to Saul, and Saul was aware that David had spared his life then, and Saul said, "You're a better man than I am," and for a little while quit chasing him. Although that didn't last long. Abishai was the single person who was with David when that event happened, when he slipped into Saul's camp. He was also a general over a third of the army back during the time when Absalom rebelled and brought his army to fight David's army. So Abishai was in charge of a part of the army. And then here, he literally saves David's wife. Again, it was Josephus, the historian, who wrote that he literally took his shield and laid it over David to protect him as he lay on the ground. And then he proceeded to kill the giant who was trying to kill David, because David was literally exhausted to the point of not being able to battle anymore. But there's more that's going to happen here. Of course, first of all, David's men said, we can't let this happen anymore. You are the king. You are the lamp of Israel. You're the light. You're our leader. You're the one we look to. And you're too important to be out here fighting with us, because something like this could happen and Abishai wouldn't be around to save you. So we don't want you coming to battle with us anymore, even though apparently David was pretty brave and had gone with him on other occasions. So that was going to be the end of that. We also see as we read on that there were skirmishes with the Philistines, and there were at least 4 giants, this being one of them here, killed by Abishai. There were 4 giants in all, 3 others who were specifically mentioned, who were killed by David's men. And so the Philistines were known, among other things, for having these men who had grown well above the size of an average person, and their weapons reflected that, and they were very feared on the battlefield. However, David's soldiers were successful against many of them, and of course successful in ways that they were lauded in these verses that we'll come to later on. So Abishai saves David's life. Now, at a time that apparently was coming closer to the end of David's life, David is going to praise God for deliverance. It's going to be a song of deliverance, literally, as he says these things that could be approached as poetry or approached as song because of the way that David wrote them. We look at some of that. It begins in verse 1 of chapter 22. And David spake unto the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord had delivered him out of the hand of all his enemies and out of the hand of Saul. So this was sometime after most of the successes had taken place. And no matter who was trying to kill David, he was unsuccessful because God, he said, had protected him. And so he sings this song, this poetic song of praise, of gratitude, of uplifting God personally. And of course, this would most likely be known to the people. This was written down. And so these things were no doubt known by much of Israel. How David's deliverance, how his safety, how the center of his life was around God, even though we know he made some mistakes along the way. As that song continues, it's interesting all of the words that he uses here in verse 2 of this song. This is primarily what we're going to look at. And he said, that's David, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in him I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior. So all of these suggesting in one way or another the idea of protection and safety and escaping from his enemy, but each of them with a little bit different of a connotation. The word for rock there, which by the way is different from the word for rock later on in this verse, meant a lofty place, up on a high place on rocks on a hillside, mountainside, where it was a safe location where people would not easily get to him, perhaps could not get to him at all to attack him or hurt him. That's why he saw God's deliverance. And then he was a fortress. He said God was his fortress, which was something like what we think of as a castle today, a place that was designed to repel the enemy and protect those who were inside. And he's his deliverer. That was a word that suggested someone who was able to provide escape for another person, which of course is what God did through a lot of helpers and a lot of circumstances that were there in David's life. And then, of course, my God, we understand that word, and my rock. And again, this is a different word than the first rock. It means literally a cliff, the side of a cliff, a place again that's similar to a lofty place, perhaps a type of it, but it's a cliff where he's safe, where again his enemies just can't get to him, and he can just relax. And then God is his shield. The shield, of course, being a part of the armor. That thing that Josephus said was what Abishai laid over David to protect him while he went and killed the giant who was after David's life. The horn of my salvation. Now, salvation suggests deliverance. Of course, not necessarily spiritual salvation here, but literal physical salvation, at least in the events of his life. And the word horn, almost always in the Old Testament, suggests power, because beasts with horns were thought to be powerful. So the horn of something was suggesting the power of something. So the power of God's deliverance, he's thankful for. And then he says, my stronghold, and that's a word which meant a high tower, a place again where the enemies could not easily get to him, and he was safe. And then refuge, a word which means a place to escape to when the enemy is coming towards you. And then finally, Savior here, which in its of course, it means saving in the metaphorical sense, but it literally begins with its meaning of an open place, an open area. And of course, you think of being safe in an open area. There's no enemies around you. You've just got space. And that's the concept here that leads to the idea of being saved, being a savior, because there's nothing but open space around me. There are no enemies who are trying to take my life. So this here is something of the core of David's song to God, which goes on, several more verses here in chapter 22. But David is just so thankful for what God has done for him. Now, we're going to jump down to verses 21 through 24 as David continues this song of praise. The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his rules were before me, and from his statutes I did not turn aside. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from guilt. Now, as we reflect back over David's life, if we were reading this sort of in just an open context somewhere, a statement that David made, we might think, now, David, I'm not so sure you're telling the whole story here, because we all know the different instances in which David did not use good judgment, in which he outright sinned, and he was called to account for that before God by means of people that God sent to him. In fact, one of those cases is coming up in chapter 24 here in just a moment. So to say that all of these things, that the God did this for me because of my righteousness, my cleanness of soul, he rewarded me. That might seem a little bit unusual at first. But if we read these things, what we get to eventually is an understanding that David wasn't saying at any point he'd been perfect. He was not saying, I've never done anything wrong. What he's saying is, I never long-term forgot the law of God. I never, in the long run, failed to come back to God. When I made mistakes, I still knew the Lord's ways, and I came back to them. And when I went away, when I went astray, I came back to him. A number of the Psalms reflect that as well, that David was the author of. He recognized that he made serious mistakes, but that didn't send him away. That did not drive him away from God. He didn't slowly get worse and worse in a spiritual relationship with God, which of course is what Saul did, his predecessor. Saul made mistakes, and they just simply kept mounting up until finally Saul no longer sought God's will. He went to the witch to get the answer there. He was very unrighteous in so many ways, and he never apparently attempted to recover from it in a serious way. That's the difference between Saul's behavior and David's behavior. And so David expresses this praise to God for rewarding him because he always came back to him, no matter what was happening, no matter the fact that he committed adultery, he murdered, he made serious mistakes, did not consult God sometimes. Still, he came back to God, and because of that, God protected him. So now we're going to move into chapter 23, which is called David's Last Words, the heading in many Bibles, if you're looking at that, which of course is not inspired. Those words are not inspired by God. They're put in there by the publishers of the Bibles to suggest here's kind of the gist of what happened in these next few verses. And that's what happened. These were considered David's last words, although after we read his last words, we're going to go on to read some other events that obviously took place before these last words. And so that's why we say we're not talking about chronological order here. So David's last words, very clearly. Now these be the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, said, and the man who was raised up on high, the anointed of God, Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel, said, the Spirit of the Lord spake by me, and his word was in my tongue. So David is simply making very clear that he wrote a number of things by way of inspiration. It wasn't simply David's opinion. It was God speaking through David, the sweet psalmist of Israel. And his psalms were very sweet, and they're very meaningful to us today because we go through difficult times. You know, David made mistakes and recovered from them. David was chased by his enemies and seemingly in difficult situations, and God protected him through him, and he came back. And so David is really still praising God in a sense because, you know, God took care of me through these things. And when I wrote down the things that I wrote down about these experiences, it certainly would help other people with their experiences. He said, this is God writing through me. It's God's words, God's authorship through David with his language. And then in chapter 23 and verse 5, he says that the reason that these things happened to him in such a good way, the deliverance, the inspiration, is because his house stood with God and God caused him to prosper. Now, to move through chapter 23, we find a mention in some of the exploits of David's mighty men. Remember, some of these men were with him from the very start when Saul was just starting to chase him. He had defenders, people who were on his side, and they're going to be mentioned here. And some of them had some really outstanding victories. And throughout the end of this chapter, some of those are shared. On one occasion, this was in the battle with the Philistines. David was in a secure place, but the Philistines were all around. In fact, they were garrisoned there right near the city of Bethlehem. And David longed and said, this is in the presence of his soldiers, oh, that one would give me drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem. Now remember, this is David's city, Bethlehem. And he no doubt had fond memories of this. He knew it well. And there he is in battle and thinking about the taste of that water, which he drank perhaps even as a child, which is by the gate. And the three mighty men break through the host of the Philistines and drew water out of the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate and took it and brought it to David. So they were brave. They went through and were not afraid of the whole Philistine garrison, which was nearby. They fought their way through. They got the water because David, perhaps just on a whim, just on an emotional reminiscence there, thinking about that water and that well and, you know, happier days in a sense. They heard that and they said, we're going to get him some of that water. And they did. And what happened when they came back is interesting. Nevertheless, he would not drink thereof, but poured it out unto the Lord. And the reason that he expressed the need to pour it out was because that was almost like sacred water. Here are three men who were dedicated to him, had risked their lives to bring this water to him. And he did not feel right. He did not feel deserving to drink that water, considering the cost that it was to bring it to him. Now, we might not think that way today, but that's sort of the way they thought a lot of times back then. The sacrifice that's been made for this water, it's just too great. I can't treat this like a common drink of water. And so he just didn't throw it out on the ground as if it were nothing. And that's all that happened. He poured it out unto the Lord. In other words, it was sort of like a drink offering, which they had back in those days. And he poured that out before the Lord. He sacrificed it to the Lord, just as those three soldiers had sacrificed in fighting their way to the well and bringing it to him. Now, as we move into chapter 24, we find a kind of an interesting and in some ways a little bit mysterious event in David's life. Again, having no doubt occurred before his last words, otherwise his last words wouldn't have been what they were. But he decides that he's going to have a census. He's going to count the people that he is king of there in Israel. And he decides to tell Joab, and Joab, working with his other assistants and aides in the army, had a job to do. The king said to Joab, the commander of the army, who was with him, go through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba. Remember, Dan to Beersheba, from the north to the south. That represented all of Israel. That's what David was saying. Go through the whole land and number the people, that I may know the number of people. Now, what was David's motivation here? A simple explanation would be that he needs to know, he wants to know how strong he is as a king, as a nation. Perhaps that's some way of building confidence for him. We aren't really told the heart of David's thinking. However, we are told that God sort of allowed David to come up with this idea because the Lord was dissatisfied. He was displeased with the actions of the Israelites. So it wasn't that just David made a serious mistake here. The Israelites had been doing things that God did not approve of. And he was going to use this occasion to punish some of them. So David tells Joab, go out and count the people. Joab knew this was not a good idea. He knew that the only thing David needed to know was that God was there with him. It had worked before, and it would work from there on out. So Joab tried to dissuade him. Joab said to the king, may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my Lord the king still see it. But why does my Lord the king delight in this thing? In other words, may you be blessed, David. May your kingdom grow 100 times more in population than it is now, while you're still alive to see it. But why do you want to do this thing? Why do you want to have this census? Joab recognized the attitude that seemed to be reflected by making this count, doing this census. And so he at least questions David. But David, of course, being the king, has the final say. And he says for him to go. And that's exactly what Joab, with the help of his helpers within the army, do. They go out to count the people. Now, after this has taken place, we find that a representative from God comes to David. His name is Gad. He was a prophet of sorts, someone who God gave information to, in this case, to take that information to King David about what he had done. So Gad came to David and told him and said unto him, shall 7 years of famine come unto thee in the land? Or wilt thou flee 3 months before thine enemies while they pursue thee? Or that there be 3 days pestilence in thy land? Now advise and see what answer I shall return to him that sent me. And so Gad says, David, here's the choice that God has given you. It's a three-part answer here. And you've got to choose one of these. You can have 7 years of famine. people starving to death. Terrible thing. Or you can have 3 months where you're on the run again, like you were with Saul, like you were with Absalom when he tried to take over. You can have 3 months of that. Or you can have 3 days of pestilence, that is plague, disease, striking the nation, and people were going to die from that. Well, David had a choice in the consequences, and he chose the last one. He said he did not want to be punished at the hands of man, which could have happened if they'd had famine and not had enough food, and people had come and taken advantage of that from other nations, or enemy from among men came and pursued him for 3 months. He would rather that it be the Lord's hand, the pestilence from the Lord's hand that he suffered, because he would rather be punished by God because of his knowledge of him than by men whose situation, motivation, and so forth he might not be familiar with. He felt like that was the best of the 3 possibilities. One thing we can notice about that is this sort of demonstrates the nature of sin, that when there are consequences, while one may be a little bit better or worse than another, none of them are good. When consequences come, consequences of sin are always bad. And in this case, it's going to be very bad. David says, let me fall into the hand of God and not in the hand of men. So the 3 days of pestilence comes, the plague. The angel of the Lord comes down and brings that plague, and it moves through Israel. And David is of the understanding that he's going to have to make a sacrifice to God, hoping that that will be the end of the famine. And so he goes to a location there, a place owned by Araunah, and who has a threshing floor, the place where the grain is processed. He has oxen there, and perhaps he has a big agricultural situation. And Araunah doesn't know what he's there for at first, but David explains to him. And when Araunah understands what the cause is and what needs to be done, he said, Lord, you're not going to buy this from me. He said, here's my oxen, you can sacrifice them. Here's the implements that I use. You can use that for the wood that you burn. He says, this is yours. This is important. You're the king. You can do this. Well, let's see what happened after that particular part of the conversation. But the king said to Araunah, no, but I will buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. So there's a principle, not just an Old Testament principle, but a constant principle of relationship with God. When we sacrifice, the word sacrifice means we're giving up something. It doesn't mean that something is taken that has no value to us. It means it's something that we say, this is a cost to me. I'm paying a price in doing this to God. It's not much of a price considering what God has done for me, but still there's a price to be paid. And that's what a sacrifice is. That's why David said, I'm not going to offer burnt offerings to God that you give me. I'm going to have to pay for them. So it really is a sacrifice. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord responded to the plea for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. And so the same material was used. An altar was built on the threshing floor. The same oxen were used, the wood from the implements. The difference being David purchased all of this. It cost him something. This could really be called a sacrifice. And because of the nature of this sacrifice, and because of God's love for David and for his people, at this point, his anger was appeased. And the plague stopped there at the threshing floor as David was offering this particular sacrifice to him. And so we come to the end here of these particular exploits of David, we come to the end of 2 Samuel. And what I would like to do again is to remind you that we'll be continuing these lessons. They'll be only available on live stream for a while, but then, Lord willing, we'll be resuming our Wednesday evening services, our auditorium class, and this is what this material is generally used for. And so these will still be available by way of the live stream or by way of the internet. So if you'd like to keep up with these, they'll be coming, and here's the address to find out what you need to know about accessing them, about accessing any of their other classes, recordings that we have posted, or just information about us. We would love to hear from you and hope that you will consider, if you're within the distance of being with us, that you'll come and be with us for any of our services. Call us if you'd like to talk about anything that you need to talk about. And we hope that your life has been valued by our study of God's Word here in this particular series in 1 and 2 Samuel. Thank you for being with us.